Okay, so yesterday we started talking about the life science section, and we spent all of the day talking about cells, the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell, and then the difference between animal and plant cells. And that's kind of where we spent the bulk of yesterday talking. So I'm not going to go over that again. Here's the diagram that we talked about yesterday. Here's the bacteria cell, which is an example of a prokaryotic cell, meaning it doesn't have a nucleus. And here is an animal cell versus a plant cell. And those both have nucleus or nuclei. So they are considered to be eukaryotic cells. Again, if none of that makes any sense, you can go back and watch yesterday's video if you want, or I can get you some materials. Today, we're kind of in between topics, so I'm gonna just see where we end up. We may stop and end and start a new topic. We might just kind of wrap up the stuff I wanted to talk about yesterday. We'll just kind of see where we get, or see where we end up at. So anyway, talking about cells is just kind of the building block of biology, or things that are made up, or what things are made up of. Sorry. Second. Again, I'm gonna not spend a lot of time going back over the stuff we went over yesterday, but essentially cells are the building blocks of life. So when we talk about most living organisms, as opposed to the very few that we consider to be unicellular, meaning they're living things made up of just one cell, like bacteria. Most things that we know of, when we think of living things, right, plants, animals, those things are made up of lots and lots of different cells that work together to create that organism, right? So humans have skin cells, blood cells, hair cells, nerve cells. So I could go down, like we have all these different types of cells that do different things that serve different purposes, right? And so that's essentially what cells do, is facilitate life, okay? Again, we don't want to dig too deep into any of that stuff because it will just end up confusing. Real briefly, we talked about the fact that cells are highly organized, that everything within a cell is designed to help that cell be as efficient as possible at doing what it's supposed to be doing. Cells acquire and utilize energy. That's going to be kind of important with what we are talking about today and into tomorrow. Cells need energy to live, period. Now, how cells go about getting that energy varies depending on the type of cell it is. But energy is vital to keeping cells alive. Okay? Cells can perform a variety of chemical reactions and regulate activities. So bottom line is, cells can do all these different things, but the end result is that they help the organism live, whatever that organism may be, whether it's a human, whether it's a tree, whether it's a dog, right? Doesn't matter, right? Cells are all designed to do the same thing. So this was our picture we left off on. Talked about some of the differences between animal and plant cells, and we talked about all the different parts of the cell, which I'm definitely not going to go through. But again, if you want to dig deeper into that, you can revisit the video from yesterday, or you can even, go to Khan Academy and look up some, or just search the internet. And you can find lots of information on cells and parts of it. So today, I want to talk just a little bit about these two concepts: active and passive transport. And so what I mean by that is things can pass through cells to other cells, right? Cells can take things and give them to other cells, and they can also receive things from other cells, okay? So we don't need to be experts at this, but I want to basically understand the difference between active and passive transport. Okay? Passive transport doesn't require any extra energy. It just naturally happens. Active transport requires energy. That's the biggest difference. Okay? Now, why is that? The reason that there are certain things that don't require energy to transport between cells has to do with this idea of diffusion. Okay. So the idea of diffusion is that things will naturally transfer from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay? And that will occur until the two sides reach an equilibrium. In other words, till the concentration is equal on the outside of the cell versus the inside in this situation. Okay, so think about it like, let me think of an example. Let's take this room that I'm in, or the room that you're in. Okay, imagine that room has no oxygen. If you could suck all the oxygen out of the room, we wouldn't last very long in it, right? We couldn't breathe. But imagine we're in a room with no oxygen, and outside of us, outside of that room, is oxygen all around. Okay? In other words, that the oxygen is highly concentrated outside of the room, and the oxygen inside of the room is none. And so there's a low concentration, or none, right? So what would happen if there was a leak in this room that allowed oxygen to transfer from outside to inside? What would happen? That oxygen would naturally fill this room until it reached the point at which the concentration of oxygen in the room was equal to the concentration out of the room. In other words, oxygen naturally diffuses from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until it reaches a balancing point, right? So again, if we flip that around, so imagine if we're in this room and we're taken up to outer space. So let's say we're in a spaceship or a space shuttle, right? We're in outer space. The cockpit or the living quarters of the space shuttle is filled with oxygen for us to breathe. Outside of that space shuttle is space where there is no oxygen, or a very low amount of it, right? You get my point. So what happens if there's a breach, right? If there is a leak of any kind, that oxygen is going to flee or leave the area of high concentration, in other words, the inside of the space shuttle, and it's going to diffuse to an area where there is less oxygen. Okay? So what ultimately is going to happen is all the oxygen from inside that space shuttle is going to leave and go outside of the space shuttle. It would be a bad thing. But again, diffusion happens naturally. That's just the way that cells and molecules react inherently. So with no extra energy. It doesn't require any effort to open the door to an oxygenless room and let the oxygen flow in. It just doesn't. But imagine the amount of energy and effort it would take to do the opposite, right? To take oxygen and push it out of this room. Right? We couldn't really do that, but right, that doesn't seem possible. If there's no oxygen in the room and there's oxygen filled up everywhere around us, the second we open that door, the oxygen is going to flood in, and to try to push it against that natural gradient is going to be hard. Okay, so that hopefully kind of makes sense. I'm going to explain it again in a little different example, but again, diffusion is just the concept that things will transfer from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration naturally. So diffusion is essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about passive transport. So Passive transport follows that idea that anything will diffuse naturally from an area of high concentration to low. It can be oxygen, it could be water, it could be anything else, right? It doesn't matter what it is, things will naturally transfer on that along those same lines. Now, specifically to water, when we're referring to water, water transporting through that process is known as osmosis. So osmosis is the diffusion of water through a cell membrane, either from the cell to outside of the cell or from outside of that cell inside. Okay. So if we take a cell of any kind, let's take a cell and we submerge it in water, the concentration of water outside of the cell is now greater because it's surrounded by water. And so what will happen is water will naturally fill the cell up until it reaches the same concentration inside of the cell as there is outside. Same thing, if we take a cell that's filled with water and we surround it by no water, right? Or put it in a very dry climate or a very dry environment, the water inside that cell will naturally leave the cell because the amount of water inside the cell is greater than the amount of water outside the cell. So I realize that was maybe over-explained. Again, active transport, as you can see in this picture, hopefully, active transport proceeds against the concentration gradient. Therefore, it requires an input of energy. Okay? So again, if you're in a sinking ship, the water is naturally going to fill your ship up. That doesn't take energy. But what takes a lot of energy is pushing that water out to keep your ship afloat, right? That requires a lot of energy. That would be active transport. You're pushing something against the natural concentration. In other words, we're trying to send things from an area of low concentration to an area that's already has a lot of something, that has a high concentration. That's not natural. Okay, that makes sense? So, with that said, let's look at a practice question on active transport versus passive transport and diffusion, and then maybe let's move into talking about what we're going to talk about tomorrow. So let me stop myself here. Well, practice. All right. So as it pertains to what we're talking about, the only thing I want to go over is number 5. Okay? So let's look at number 5. I think we're just going to do this one question and then move on to a new topic. So you can go ahead and read it to yourself if you can, and if you can't read that, I will read it in just a second. Okay. So number 5 says that diffusion is a process by which particles move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. For example, oxygen diffuses through the cell membrane of a unicellular pond organism from the water, where there is lots of oxygen, into the cell where there is less oxygen. Eventually, the concentration of oxygen inside and outside of the unicellular organism is the same. Okay? So, kind of what we talked about. A little bit of a different example, but the same concept, right? What would happen if the concentration of oxygen were greater in the unicellular organism than its watery environment? Okay. So what it's saying is, it gives us an example. Here's a cell. Inside that cell, there is less oxygen than there is in the pond around. Therefore, the oxygen from the pond water comes into the cell, and the amount of oxygen in the cell goes up until they reach a balance. The question says, what happens if it was the other way around? What would happen if the concentration of oxygen were greater inside the cell than around it. So let's look at these four options. A, water would diffuse from the unicellular organism into the pond water. B, oxygen would diffuse from the unicellular organism into the pond water. C, oxygen would diffuse from the pond water into the unicellular organism. Or D, diffusion of oxygen between the organism and the pond water would stop. All right, so a lot of words, a lot of jargon to parse or to kind of weed out the stuff that we maybe don't know or aren't familiar with. So let's just break it down as simply as we can. So right away, the first two I would get rid of without thinking much about it are A and D. The reason I would get rid of A and D personally is, first of all, the question is talking about oxygen, right? Okay, and so the fact that B and C, well, B, C, and D are talking about oxygen. A is talking about water. The question doesn't ask us about water. There's water mentioned, but water isn't the main point of the question. The question says, what would happen if the concentration of oxygen? So I would throw out A right away because it's talking about water and not oxygen. The reason I'd throw out D, because diffusion will never stop. Diffusion happens naturally, and so diffusion of oxygen between the organism and the pond water would stop entirely isn't true because diffusion never stops. It just constantly is going. Once it reaches an equilibrium, it will continue to keep those two things equal until one gets out of balance, and then it will happen all over again. It's never really stopped. So A and D, I'd throw them out. B and C are the exact opposite. So now it's just a matter of thinking about the definition of what diffusion is and applying that to the answer. So remember, diffusion says stuff will always go from high to low. So let's look at those again. B, oxygen would diffuse from the organism into the pond water. C says oxygen will diffuse from the pond water into the unicellular organism. We go back and look at our question. The question says, what happens if the concentration is greater in the cell than outside of it? So the concentration is higher inside the cell, lower outside of the cell. So what would happen? Diffusion goes from high to low. The oxygen would diffuse from the organism into the pond water, not the other way around. So B is the answer. Okay? So I realize that was a lot. Part of this is why I don't love going over biology. It's not that it's not interesting. It's that there's so many terms and a lot of technical stuff that we kind of have to go through. And so I apologize if I am boring any of you to death, or if it's just like way over your head. I get it. And the only thing I can say is don't panic, right? You don't need to be an expert in any of this. I'm just kind of pumping it all out there. Hopefully some of the big concepts stick. Otherwise, just getting a very basic dose of this is going to be all you need, right? And then again, practicing lots of questions. Why I do this every day, right? Not because I know these questions are super fun and that everyone loves doing practice. Because this is the best way that you can prepare for the GED. With that said, I'm going to not give us any more practice questions for the day and spend the last 10 minutes starting the topic that we're going to talk about tomorrow, which is fine because we've got a lot to get through tomorrow, so that will work out great. So, here's where we were. Diffusion and active and passive transport. I'm not going to go over any more of that today. Okay, so where we're going to move on from there is we're going to spend the rest of today and tomorrow talking about plants. Just kind of a general, bigger picture way. So now, not looking so much at just cellular level and looking more at an organism level. In other words, bigger picture. So we're not looking at the things that make up a tree, we're talking about the tree itself. So when we talk about plants, just like a lot of the stuff we've talked about, scientifically, they are broken up into categories. Okay? The biggest and most basic split in plants is non-vascular versus vascular. Okay? Think of vascular. I don't actually know what vascular means per se, but when I think of vascular, I think of veins. Okay, so non-vascular would be like stuff without veins. So when you think of like a leaf and you can see the little branches, or you can like look and see the little tubes inside of a leaf, that kind of a weird word, but they look like veins. I don't think they call them veins. I'm just brain farting, right? But if you look at that, like, water is transferred along those highways, right? Non-vascular plants don't have those. They're the oldest, they're the least complex, and they're basically just tube-like structures. They're designed to move water from one end to the other, and they're dependent on having moisture because they're not as complicated or complex in the way that they're made up is less complicated, more like if you were to compare like a jellyfish to a human, right? The level of complexity there is not close. Same thing with non-vascular plants compared to vascular plants. Think about moss. Moss is technically a plant, but it's less complex than a big redwood tree. There's less going on, right? So mosses need moisture to live. And all plants need some amount of moisture, but vascular plants can withstand much longer periods of drought because they store water in different ways. Whereas mosses and other non-vascular plants have to have a steady supply of water. Okay? So when we talk about vascular plants, these are the majority of other plants we're thinking. Okay. Whoa. So true land plants, that just means they have adapted to live at kind of all over the world in dry or varying levels of dry climates. And like it says there, they've evolved ways to survive independent of wet environment, right? So when you think of moss, moss only grows in a very specific part of the world where it's wet enough to allow that moss to survive. But if you go, say, from western Washington to eastern Washington, most mosses can't survive because it's drier. We still have trees and plants here. So again, vascular plants have evolved ways to live in drier climates. So within vascular plants, of course, science has to break things down again. So within vascular plants, we have seedless plants and we have seed plants. Seedless plants would be things like horsetails or ferns, whereas seed plants are, you guessed it, things that have seeds, right? That produce seeds that then the next generation grows from those seeds. All right. So seedless plants, seedless vascular plants are a relatively small group. So again, we're going to focus on the seed plants because they make up a bigger chunk of the plant kingdom. And I believe this is the last breakdown we're going to do, but seed plants can again get broken down into two categories also. And those categories are gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are seeds that are not encased in a fruit. Think pines, firs, redwoods, they all produce seeds in some kind of cone structure. That would be a gymnosperm. Angiosperms are things that produce a seed, but it's encased in some kind of fruit, right? Apple tree, pear tree, right? All you can go down all all the way through all the different fruits. They have that fruit exists because there's a seed inside it. And that fruit is protecting that seed until it becomes time for that seed to fall down and get buried in the earth and produce a new tree or a new plant. Okay. Again, don't panic and think I have to remember all this stuff. If you're like taking notes, notes are always good, but you don't need to know all these different terms. Just throwing them out there. You're going to see some of these on the test. You're not going to need to remember the difference between a gymnosperm and an angiosperm. You get a question on the test like that, they're going to tell you, this is a gymnosperm, blah, 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 seeds are not encased in a fruit. They'll explain what it is, and then ask you a question about that. But they won't require you to memorize stuff. Not a memory test. So don't think you have to memorize all these terms. All right, so I should have, okay. Well, let's see. I'm torn because I don't want to rush through this. Let's pause and stop here. So I'm going to go over parts of the plants starting tomorrow. So my last takeaway here with plants is, right, just these basic different categories. We have old, not complex, non-vascular plants versus vascular. And within vascular plants, we have seed and seedless plants. And within seed plants, we've got those two classifications of gymnosperm, angiosperm. Tomorrow, we're going to go through the various parts of a plant, right? So roots, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, and look at what those parts are and why they're important to the plant, okay? And what they do. So we're going to start there tomorrow. If no one has any questions, I will let everyone go for the day, and I will be back with more science tomorrow and more social studies for those of you that have been going to social studies class in the mornings. You'll see me there as well. So I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and until I talk to you tomorrow, adios.